Good evening and welcome to the Marion Miner Cook Athenaeum. My name is Sarah Sunbar and I'm one of the Ath Fellows here. Art and politics have a fascinating relationship. They are constantly playing off each other, serving to undermine, reinforce, and subvert the narratives and ideas presented by the other. Theater has a unique position in the arts to present us with truth through fiction as we see pieces of ourselves in the characters on stage. Tonight, playwright J.T. Rogers will be in conversation with his childhood friend and CMC's own professor, Helen, as they debate and discuss politics, art, and the role of theater in shaping policy. J.T. Rogers is an award-winning playwright whose works have been seen across the world. His most recent play, Oslo, will be reopening on Broadway in the spring of 2017, and he has written a diverse range of works, including The Overwhelming, Blood and Gifts, White People, and Madagascar. He is a 2012 Guggenheim Fellow in Playwriting and has received awards from the Pinter Review, American Theater Critics Association's Osborne Award, and the William Ing Center for the Arts New Voices Award. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording is strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Professor Helland and J.T. Rogers.
So I wanted to thank everyone for coming, and I'm just going to indulge myself in a quick, just for one quick moment. In fourth grade, being raised by hippies, I didn't actually have a television set. And what I did was make friends with the next person in line who did have a television set, who told me all about a show called Battlestar Galactica. This would have been the 70s, so this was, and he would each week tell me the episode while we waited in line, fill me in on the details. Now, you might remember, for those of you that know, that years later they remade this, as apparently we do with all 70s TV now. And what I discovered, I thought I would go back and watch the 70s version, is that actually your stories were much better than the bad 70s TV. Yes. So I think I knew at that point you were going to do something involving storytelling and be fairly famous at it. But it was a great deal of fun. So what we'd like to do, this is, I guess the best way to say this is well, I guess 30-year conversation that you and I have been having, although probably 20 years, about the role of arts in public life.
Yeah, I don't think we did that in sixth grade, actually.
I'm sure we did.
So.
Right after Battlestar Galactica, that's what we were doing. But several years ago, we went, for example, to New Dramatists and talked about this, the role of funding in the arts. I don't really recall you mentioning that everyone in the room was going to be a playwright, an actor, or a director. That was a fun moment. But I thought what I would do is just kind of begin this with sort of a discussion of your methods, sort of where you came from, a little bit about your background, and then I want to sort of take us into kind of the topic of the day, which is sort of the role of arts in public policy. So here's my first question sort of on your biography. Yeah. You and I grew up in Columbia, Missouri. What's the path that sort of gets a college professor's kid from Columbia, Missouri to being a playwright in New York City? Other than Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah, I think it starts and ends with Battlestar Galactica. A winding one. So in brief, I grew up in the college town of Columbia, Missouri, which is that little slightly more intellectual and interesting blue dot that every state has. I also, my parents got divorced when I was young, and my mom in the late 70s, as a very young kid, moved to the East Village to be an artist. That's a whole world that isn't like that anymore. And so I would toggle between sort of very poor, quasi-slum-like conditions in New York and suburban Missouri, and then I got to see all sorts of. I thought they were just interesting things my mom was taking me to see in little basement theaters, but now you discover years later these were iconic, shows that were obviously shaping of my life. And then my father was a political scientist, did a number of years of field research in rural Malaysia and Indonesia, so I went and lived in rural Malaysia and Indonesia as a child. And then I went to acting conservatory, and then from there sort of came to New York and started a little theater company with friends and switched sides of the table and became the person writing the work as opposed to acting in the work. And then spent endless years cleaning toilets and driving the trolley car in Central Park and waiting tables and copy editing House and Garden magazine. If you want to talk about mid-century toile, I am your guy. Until I learned how to do plays and how to write plays that people would do. And then my career started when sort of off the slush pile, the National Theatre in London picked a play of mine, and then I was, a 20-year in the making overnight success. Yeah.
So one of the things that's fascinated me about your method, and I mean this in the kindest way possible to an old friend, but you're something of a magpie in that you pick up pieces of conversation. When we were in high school, someone, an English teacher, showed us a movie called My Dinner with Andre, which I'm guessing there's like 3 of us in the room that have ever seen this movie or even heard of it. There we go. Oh, we're up to 4. You actually decided to seek out Andre Gregory and strike up a friendship and a conversation with him. Yeah. And you've done this over and over and over again, which I find this fascinating. You have sort of maintained long-time friendships with, I don't know, say economists, but also...
Friendship might be too strong.
Yeah, fair enough. Intellectual battle.
Yeah, that's great.
But this also includes Colin Powell, former directors of the CIA. I mean, in the course of your writing, you seem to have this amazing ability to have conversations with people that, as an academic, I would think would be utterly inaccessible.
Yeah, I have been really fortunate to have that. I think that it's funny being a creative writer that when you're supposed to talk about why you do things, you're like, wait, if I talk about it, it'll go away. I write plays and now going into film and television that is, what interests me is private, emotionally gripping stories, be they serious or comedic, but that are set against larger historical or political events, just because I think the stories are more meaty and more interesting. And as those who sat with me at dinner can tell, I like to talk, and I'm interested in people that talk, and I think I like to write stories about people who are willing to, for whom ideas are worth dying for, in the way that Shakespeare's characters are. And so some of this is just putting things together years after the fact when you realize, oh, that's why the trajectory of your life went that way. When you're doing it, you're not really aware of it. So I'm interested in politics and history and ideas, and with a good fart joke and a handgun in the second act is always important. And so you meet, it's that process of, in any profession, where you meet someone and they open their Rolodex to you and their Rolodex to you and forward. And I have gotten to meet a lot of extraordinary, spies and journalists and politicians and victims of genocide. And I don't really have a method of talking to people, but I think that when I speak to people, when I get the okay from someone they know who says, he's not a Yahoo, he knows what he's talking about, you should take his phone call. When I meet them in person, and sometimes, traveling across the world, just the fact that you've done that gives you the cred that someone said, well, it must be important enough that they've flown, from America to meet with me. I don't interview people. I guess that's it. I don't interview people. I talk with them. I never audio tape things, and I'm not a journalist, and I try to make very clear when I'm speaking to people that I'm not interested in a political point of view. I'm not interested in their story. I'm not interested in a side's argument. Really, if I'm talking to, the one guy, I spent a lot of time with Jack Devine, who personally ran the Stinger missile program against the Soviets, and he basically became a character in this play. I wrote Blood and Gifts. In reality, in the play, he has the exact opposite political view of Jack, but because I took politics and the CIA seriously, he was delighted just to see complicated ideas about the CIA put on stage. But when you meet someone like him, which is often the case, you begin a conversation, and they're lecturing you as if you were a journalist, to teach you, how things really are. And I've learned that your job is to just listen, and then slowly put a couple nuggets of information, say, oh, that's right, because when you were in the Mujahideen Valley in 1983, you had that conversation with so-and-so, and that led to that fight. And then after doing it 3 or 4 times, there's a shift in the conversation, and the person you're speaking to begins to realize that you actually know a lot, so you can skip over that stage. And then ultimately, I was in the UAE interviewing politicians for a project that I'd written for HBO that in the end didn't get filmed, but was sort of fascinating to do. And I would literally sit down and say, before we get started, I want you to know I'm not a journalist. I'm not interested All I'm interested is I really want your point of view so that a character in the show will be fully rounded and believable and interesting holding your point of view. So instead of talking about your views on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and should it be the Gulf of Tehran or the Gulf of Saudi Arabia, could you tell me what your favorite breakfast food is? And do you always wear the hijab, or are there days of the week when you don't have to wear it in the office? And how do you physically change when you have to go meet someone in the other room? Do you actually take it off before you meet them? And then you're moving the conversation away from the intellectual to a more personal level. And hopefully, not every person you meet and absorb information you're successful at, and maybe it's not that useful, but I like to meet people and learn things that I don't know. So I feel very blessed, to use an overused, but in this case, apt word of the moment. You just meet the most interesting people. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
I guess a follow-up question would be, how do you know when you have an interesting story? Because one of the things that fascinates me as as your friend and then someone who's read kind of all of your work, seen a number of your plays performed, the thing that strikes me is that these, and I don't mean to be, it's never good to flatter your childhood friends, but I don't remember a misfire, right? I don't remember something where
you just didn't read those plays.
Yeah, well, okay, there's that. But it's interesting to me that you seem to have a very good sense of what kind of balances being entertaining and really kind of intellectually engaging. And I guess I'm curious, what's the trick to?
The trick is, which isn't a trick. The trick is the again overused phrase, but really true. It's the 10,000 hour rule. If you spend 10,000 hours being a playwright, you learn how to skip over a lot of steps because you've learned how to hit the ball. It doesn't mean you're always going to be, hopefully you'll feel that way in the next two plays, but the creation of them is full of profound anxiety and self-loathing and all those wonderful qualities of the creative life. But one of the things we were just talking about at our table about how do you do work and the idea of having a plan that goes forward in your life versus sort of things are always being shifted under your feet is kind of being open to just acknowledging that there's things, you just have to be open for stories that are going to come your way or seeds that will move to something. The most extreme example is the play you mentioned earlier, my play Oslo, which is about this so I've written this play Oslo. So open Lincoln Center did very, very well, and now we're moving to Broadway, which is quite thrilling. And so the origin of this particular play was my last play at Lincoln Center, this play Blood and Gifts, about the Afghans and the Soviets in the 80s that I mentioned earlier, with the CIA interviewee. I was doing the play, and as part of the rehearsal process, the director and I brought in people who had lived through experiences in the play, spies, journalists, who'd been involved with covering the Mujahideen, Afghans who had to flee the country, who now ran peace initiatives in New York, and they speak to the actors so that there's a contextual depth to what they're doing on top of what I've written for them. And because his daughter was friends with this girl whose father was this guy, my director brought in a man named Tyrod Larson, who was a big shot at the UN at the point. And he was brought in just to talk about what real diplomacy is like. And he was very flattering about the play, and because it's about diplomacy and sort of the cutthroat nature of the double game. And then he came to see Blood and Gifts and loved it. And then we went out for drinks across from the theater where I ended up doing my next play again. And as we're drinking and drinking and drinking and talking and drinking, he is Norwegian, so there's that. I find out that this guy and his wife had hatched the secret channel that led to the Oslo Peace Accords. And he starts telling me about sneaking Palestinian members of the PLO into Norway in the middle of the night in rental cars and hiding out in a castle, and everyone's drinking Johnny Walker Black, talking about the children. And I thought, well, there's the next play. And so then that set me down a whole rabbit hole of a year and a half of research and travel and interviewing people. But you just don't know. So there is an element of the constant waiting. You're constantly on the cusp waiting for what might be next.
So you may just have answered this question, but it's one I've been wanting to put to you, like in some form where you're more or less under oath. So early on, a lot of your plays dealt with the personal. So I think about White People, a play you wrote 20 years ago that's oddly prescient. you have another play, Madagascar, that
Yeah.
deals with, a mystery and an unfolding and a sense of loss. These are really deeply personal plays. At some point, you transitioned into what I teasingly call public policy theater. You write on the Rwandan genocide, you write on the CIA secret wars, now the Oslo peace process.
Right.
Was there a conscious transition, or just the good story that came along happened to now be
I don't
a
think there was
grander
a
theme?
conscious, sorry to cut you off, there wasn't a conscious transition at the moment. I mean, you can see the trajectory is clearer once you look in the past. I think some of it, it's funny when you talk about your work as an artist, or certainly specifically in my case as a playwright and a writer, when you talk about it with people who are not doing the same work, understandably, of course, the conversation becomes about why did you choose, these larger philosophical issues. But so much of the time when you're actually making the work, you're not thinking about the larger ideas of why you did this and how does it fit into the meta-narrative of X, Y, and Z, which are all, again, very valid questions. You're sort of, you're more like a craftsperson. You're a boat maker. So you're obsessively trying to make a boat that will float. You're trying to make something that won't sink. You're trying to cut through the water beautifully. And in some ways, you focus on that so you don't have to answer those other questions, because, when you start asking those questions in the middle of the night, then you start looking at yourself outside yourself, and then you can get trapped in your own anxiety. But I think that having hindsight then to answer your question, I think some of it was just acknowledging that these things had always interested me, so why wasn't I writing about them? I think that in a weird way, we were talking about this at dinner a moment ago, that I don't view them as less personal. They're, on the surface, way less personal in terms of, well, you're not a Rwandan, you're not a Afghan warlord, you're not a Jordanian-based Palestinian. But in a way, the distance, by casting the story very, very far away from me personally on the surface, it allows you in a weird way to be more autobiographical. Or the further away, like when I was an actor, I was terrible whenever I was playing, when I was a 25-year actor playing a 25-year-old white American, I was abysmal. But when I was cast as the old man with the bad teeth and the hunched back, I was amazing. And because just, everyone is specifically different. And for me, the more of a mask, in theater terms, you're always trained as an actor to physically have to work with masks, because remarkably, when you put a mask on as an actor, you totally transform and you open up in a way that you can't without a mask. And so for me, often the writing is putting a mask on so that I can be liberated to actually write something interesting. I would deny any of that in print, but yeah.
I mean, one of the fascinating things, and white people comes to mind kind of most, is there's clearly some theme despite not focusing on it. And I guess, one of the things that's fascinating, there may not be an answer to this question, but that play, the amazing thing to me is...
There's a play of 3 monologues that interweave, just for context, and it's 3 white people, one in St. Louis, one in New York City, one in North Carolina, who are sort of struggling with some terrible thing that's just happened. And ultimately, the 90-minute play, as it rolls out, is these people who are, what they share, whether as white people, are sort of saying the unsayable about race in America. That's not the point of the play, but what they're struggling with is some searing moment that forces them to acknowledge that.
It's a really wrenching play, and I guess one of the things I find fascinating is that it's had a resonance, I think for the last 20 years. It's been kind of an underground sort of sensation, and I'll put you on the spot, is that a surprise to you? Is it something that, you look and say, well, these are just deeply occurring themes in America and I touch something? It's fascinating to me that play keeps popping up at various times in my life. It wins like the national speech and debate dramatic interp, by a high school student. There's just various ways in which that play keeps coming back in my life.
It's so funny. I just had this memory as you're saying that. This just popped into my head. And any writer I know, creative, or not even creative, just someone who's doing something that they don't know where they're going, is going to have a moment like what I'm about to say to you. I vividly remember writing that play, being not much older than those of you who are students here in the room. And I had finagled my way to get a pass to use the library at NYU. Okay, I had cheated and lied and gotten myself a pass because I couldn't afford the $50 a year, but I needed a place to work. And I was working on this play. I'd walked through it gotten a deluge of rain. It was unexpected. So I'm in one of those little cubicles. My feet are soaking wet. I'm struggling with the play. The couple next to me has gone from necking to full out having sex in the cubicle next to me. Full on, loud sex. And I remember thinking this sort of utter dismay of this will never get done. What am I thinking? I mean, and now you're asking this question, why is the play still resonant 20 years later?
Yeah.
And it's because of that couple having sex, really.
Yeah,
That
seemed obvious to me.
You learn something new every day. I wrote that play because the beginning of, I'm just trying to remember now, the beginning of that play was, there's a crucial moment in the play where one of the three characters in some ways is sort of the moral center of the play, this young Midwestern guy who's, compared to the other two, on the surface more like me, is in Stuyvesant Park in New York City, and he's slowly revealing this traumatic thing that's happened. And in the play, sort of the most harrowing moment of the play is him reenacting and reliving for us he and his wife being attacked by three young black kids, and the sort of horror, not only the horror of the attack, but the rage and things that came out of his mouth as it was going on, and how it transformed him. And that play happened because, again, only in hindsight would I be able to put this together. I was walking through Stuyvesant Park, and in a far less dramatic way, I saw these two kids harassing this sort of white hippie kid, white NYU hippie kid. It was a class issue and a race issue all at once. And I was really angry and disturbed by it, but also sort of unnerved by the things that were going through my mind. And I thought, well, there's the beginning of a play. Because I'm like, what does that mean? And then, of course, it completely went off on its own and became something completely separate from my own. And the theater must be distilled and dramatic. So what I had was a very small little internal moment. They did not transform my life, but it was that spark in a different way, but similarly to what I described with Osso, was you're just looking for those defining experiences where you think there's a trail to follow. You're always following trails that don't go anywhere. Wouldn't it be cool if I wrote a story about this, or what if I did that, and you start and you're like, maybe not so much.
So I want to change gears before we get to the controversial title of this talk, which I know I'm taking a long time there, but I figure we'll get to allowing you to attack journalism more fully. But I wanted to just talk a little bit about growing up in Columbia, Missouri. I mean, you and I grew up in, as you said, the little blue dot in the middle of a very large sea of red. And it's interesting because, you and I were talking about this earlier today. In that context, what was unusual about that town was that you had one extra group of professionals. You always have doctors, lawyers, ministers, and then you had college professors. And it's interesting to me because you kind of moved between the world of New York and the world of this small Midwestern college town we grew up in. I remember being, this is maybe more of a revelation in front of a room full of people than you want, but I remember being very envious of the college professors. Doesn't take a psychologist to figure out how that connected the dots. But it was, that was sort of what you aspired to. What's interesting to me is that college
professors, I wanted to run away because I had that life. You didn't have that life, so you wanted that life.
But there's a lot to that. Yeah. Maybe more than I want to go into at this exact moment. But I find it fascinating that those people, the archetypes of our sort of growing up, those college professors show up a lot in your plays. They show up in Madagascar. They show up in, and I'm curious why. Is there something about, why do you hate your people, John?
Because I'm a traitor to my class. It's so funny because I didn't. To me, it's just useful flotsam and jetsam. You're like, well, I know about that, so I can use that as a starting point. I mean, I put the Economist as an economist in Madagascar because we were having this ongoing. I was fascinated. I couldn't understand what you did. I found it ridiculous, and then you had to explain to me. And I became really interested in the difference between micro and macro. And I was working the play, oh, well, since I've now learned a lot about that, I should make that's the surface level answer.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's deeper levels. And when I was writing The Overwhelming, the character is an American academic who's gotten something like a Fulbright, and he's taken his family there, and it takes place about 4 months before the genocide. And when they get there, they realize that shit is going down, and they didn't know. And what was fascinating to learn is that we don't understand this now, but nobody knew what was happening. And 100 days before the genocide began, all of a sudden roadblocks went up in the 3 main cities in Rwanda, and people were murdered, and then the roadblocks disappeared overnight. And everyone, including the UN soldiers, realized there was a third force and that was being worked behind the scenes, like a deep state. And so I wanted the play. I knew I couldn't write a play that took place during the actual genocide because it would be either grand guignol or morally weird to have that on stage. You have to show violence off stage for it to be effective on stage. And so I knew that was an event that had all the moral harbingers of the genocide, but wasn't the genocide, so it was a little smaller in scope. And then I had to figure out how to believably, I wanted to tell the play through an American eye so an American audience would follow it and go into like a real deep dive into Rwandan culture. And then then it became this struggle of, my first thought was like, oh, well, what could he do? And I thought, well, he could be like a college professor. I'm like, oh, that's so like, your dad's a college professor. That's such a cliche to have him a college professor. So I worked so hard to figure out believably why this American would be there, and ultimately it could only be a college professor. It was the only believable answer, so that's why he's a college professor.
That works.
In the play.
No deeper.
I'm sure there is, but you try not to. It's a funny thing. You don't want to look too deeply at those things. You just want to keep going forward.
One more off topic before we sort of get into kind of the nature of and kind of role of theater. And the last one is just a little bit about New York. So New York City's been an important part of your life as long as I've known you. Yeah. There's a lot of things in our conversations over the years that have made me question things I believe very strongly. But one of the ones that's just stuck with me, and it's very, very interesting, because you are in the Big 50, the example of the person in the rent control department. Mm. Everyone here knows you. But you moved into a rent control apartment, and I remember sort of teasing you about this largesse. And your point was really how important sort of these pockets of, I don't know what you call arts communities, were sort of in your formation as an artist. And I kind of want you to talk about this, because I think the conversation about how New York has changed in your lifetime, from a place that was very much an incubator for a young artist to a place that's, quite frankly, really too expensive.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Eric, because, and if you'd asked me this question when we last talked about this, I would have been more definitive about it. But one of the problems as a person, but benefits as an artist, as you get older, you get less sure about everything. But I think that I would still hold, my answer you have to qualify my answer that there's an element of selfishness in my response, because I got to have the apartment, right? I got to have that apartment for $400 or $350 a month. And it was a pretty crappy apartment, to put it mildly, but it was a foothold for my then girlfriend, now wife, and I to live and to be a struggling artist and not have to work 50 hours at a temp job for a while at least. But the argument I would make, which sort of can maybe segue us into the larger issue we were talking about earlier today, is that all that admitted on the table that I got the rent controlled apartment for X number of years before he moved out, was that the city of New York there was a long period where, both by the fiat of things like extended rent control and simply lower prices across the board for everything, that New York City was much more open to a diverse, politically, culturally, class-wise, and arts versus non-arts city. And what's interesting is, as that has been taken away, and as the ruthless religion of the marketplace has become the only vessel of worship in America, and what's poignant is that everyone, including the most ferocious proselytizers for a market-only city, are unhappy with the city now, because it's always a complicated balance to sort of things, well, this is going to be cheaper, this is going to be better, and we're going to put our resources to allow this to exist in some funded way. But by eliminating those pockets where people could have a toehold that normally wouldn't be there, it is homogenized the city, and it's diminished it's just a lot more like everywhere else. And it's to everyone, and ironically, it's to everyone's detriment that New York is like everywhere else. And there's always going to be people that come, young people that come and replenish the city, God bless. But it is, so I'm saying this not as the good old days were better, but more, it's an unfortunate example, I think, that I was right in this argument years ago. Usually I'm happy to win those arguments with you. This would be an example of that.
I mean, it's just interesting to me, right? Because it's, when you talk about this, it's both a more attractive place for, as you describe it, I've never lived in New York, for everyone to live, but also a place where the mere presence of a lot of young artists has a big influence
It's
on.
a huge influence. Yeah, I mean, all the music, I bet, and it's an interesting moment where people in their 20s are much more knowledgeable about music from 20 years ago than when we were, pop music, than when we were 20. But the music that I bet that most of the students here, let alone the faculty, know and love and have influence, are all done by people that were living in tiny little apartments for nothing in New York City, and this is the key thing, art is never made in a vacuum, the way that politics is not made in a vacuum, and cultural shifts in finance are not made in a vacuum. You have to be around. It's collective genius that makes things happen. The idea of the genius untethered on their own is rubbish, That's not really true.
I've got nothing to add to
You
that.
got nothing.
I
Note that he had nothing to add to that.
I
want everyone
admit
to
I
notice
have been
that.
rendered speechless.
Finally, after 31
yes, exactly.
years.
So I want to turn. I want to turn kind of in our last. I think we have about 10 or 15 minutes left, and I want to turn really kind of to the. I guess we call this kind of the nature of the arts in the present era. Maybe that's a little too broad, but
Yeah, well, I mean, I called. What did I call my talk?
I don't know. But it was not kind to journalists.
Screw you, the New York Times, or like that. Art. What's it called? Art is theater is true and journalism is not. Yeah. So I called that partially because I was in a really cross mood with the New York Times the morning I got the call, and also, this is where the world changes. I would not have titled. I titled that 6 months ago. After the last 11 days of American democracy, I would not title that. But I titled it. I titled it that purposely to be a bit provocative, because I sometimes feel the need to punch back about this idea that I'm going to put forward, is that we're living in a moment politically and culturally where nonfiction and facts are the only vessels by which we learn things and by which we view something as correct or understood or good when it comes to knowledge. And what I would submit to you, and all of you, to freely disagree with, of course, is that the truth and the information we get from our newspapers and our television and our pundits and most of our nonfiction books, which quite honestly, almost every nonfiction book in this country could be an article in The Atlantic and does not need to be 300 pages, because it's just information, it's not knowledge. And we live in this information-drenched moment, but I really passionately believe that the arts, especially narrative arts like fiction, plays, some film and television, gets to a truth that is impossible to get in a rational, fact-based medium. And that the truth about how Donald Trump went about selecting his next cabinet appointee, that information is vitally important and is learned through a newspaper. But the spiritual sense of loss of how it feels to be an American at this moment, and when you wake up at 2 in the morning and say to myself, whither my country, and in some ways, who am I now? How do I go forward? Those are the questions that we can learn and be made more human by in storytelling.
let me push you on that, because one of the things I'm curious about, I mean, you and I have talked a lot about this, but the interesting thing to me is one of the arcs, and again, back to my finding arcs in your work that
Yeah.
you don't find, but one of the arcs, interestingly enough, is that you began by putting fictional people sort of in real events, right? You know, so you know, the Blood and Gifts, the Overwhelming. You've done something very different in Oslo, right? I mean, these are people who exist out there in the world. You know, they are real
Right,
individuals.
Shimon Peres is in the play.
Yeah,
right?
and I guess one of the questions I have is, you know, you are pushing up against the edge of journalism in some sense, and yet you're making a sort of a narrative and a story that you want to be appealing to people sort of in a theater. I'm curious how you balance that, because I understand what you're saying, that there's a narrative and often.
Well, yeah, okay. Thank you for asking, because I think I could give a more practical answer than what I just said, or more practical answer. So I've written this in the play Oslo. Everyone in the play is based on a real person. They have the same name. They often and they are my theatricalization person, from Perez, the highest, who plays the highest card of power in the show, down to these two Norwegian housekeepers who I met, at the castle where they secretly shoot everyone and cook waffles for them. So everyone is, I decided it would be silly to give them phony names, because the story, once I sort of uncrack the secret layer of what happened, it's the events and people being talked about are so omnipresent that it would be, like you go to a movie and they say, a country in Africa, and you're like, what country in Africa? What do you mean a country in Africa? That's just cheap, So I knew I had to be specific like that. But then the struggle, and then the answer that, for me, that came out of that ties in what I just proselytized about, is I would submit to you, and that if you, something we talked about with your students today, is that you could watch every YouTube video and read every book about the Oslo Peace Accords, and wouldn't it be fascinating to see how much in agreement the participants were about who did what and how it happened. But separate from, I'm trying to separate it, not make this a tapping me in the back on what a fine little play I wrote, but by telling the story in a fictionalized way where you're trying to get to the spirit of the event and not be beholden to every actual thing in order that happened, that you can have the experience of like, oh my God, that's what it was like to sit across from someone who tried to have your father assassinated, and to find out that you both like Johnny Walker Black, and mother of God, your oldest daughters have the same name. So now what are we going to do? And that was the thing that fired me up as a storyteller. Like, what would it be like to be those people in that room? And I think that you can't get at that through a measured, information-based through journalism. So it's weird, because the play is journalism, in quotes, the way that Richard III is journalism. Everyone in that play is named for a real person, but God knows, even at the time, everyone knew that wasn't actually Richard III. That wasn't actually Bolingbroke. Now, in his case, it was a political attempt to curry favor, to do a theatrical, wonderful job as an artist, like besmirching the name of, the monarchs that lost the Civil War. But in my case, well, it's interesting. We'll have this conversation in a couple years, because I'm hatching another play that I'm going to write, and it's about, I think that the main characters are going to be named for and based on real people who are in history books, etc. But I think it'll be very interesting. I think because there's literally been 40 to 50 years of time passed, that the very question you're asking will not occur to people to ask. And it will not be any less, I will not have taken more liberties or less liberties, but simply the proximity to real events, I think, alters our perception of or raises the potential red flag of whether you have license to do that or not. And it's a fair question. Does he have a license to do it? I say yes. I could be wrong.
I mean, along those points, I want to broaden this a little bit, because one of the interesting things to me about you is, as you describe narrative, and in areas like the Oslo Peace Process, in the Rwandan genocide, I mean, one of the interesting things to me is that American theater has kind of gone in the opposite direction, right? And again, I don't mean this to be hypercritical of the arts, but it's just interesting to me that I don't feel like the arts is playing a tremendous role in sort of shaping narratives in the way you're describing.
Right. Well, to push back a little bit, I mean, how many new American plays do you see?
Yeah, every time I visit you.
You should come more often.
Yes.
I mean, so I disagree and I agree. I mean,
Go with the second.
okay. I think that there are, there was a great book that came out a couple years ago that was sort of a rallying cry about the alarming financial status of artists in the American theater and how it was physically impossible, almost impossible to make a living as a playwright, and there would be no profession if this wasn't addressed. And it's being addressed by the profession, which is great. But in it, without using their names, a number of artistic directors were asked to respond, and they could vent without staying their career by keeping anonymous. And one artistic director, and I think I know who it is, but I have to ask him. One artistic director who pushed back against the whole point of view of this book, which said a statement that stuck with me for years. He said, the problem with new plays in America is that the bad playwrights are writing big sweeping political plays, and the good playwrights are writing really good plays about nothing.
Huh.
And I think that is sweeping, and I wouldn't totally agree with that, but there is an interesting phenomena, and I think it just speaks to this larger American odd, to me, just for my own personal interest, the odd American tick we have is that we don't, like when I work in London, the theater is far more central to the culture, and I'm much more, in cliche, obvious terms, like a British playwright, that I write about the private against the public. And so when I'm there in the UK working, it's like, oh yeah, JT's that American playwright who's like us. And when I work in New York, it's like, and so why did you write this? even if it's well received. But I think that there's a strange strain in our culture that has always been there, which is deeply resistant to learning new things, and is also suspicious of entertainment that is not just entertainment, full stop. There's something very, like in New York, I wrote an essay for The Guardian when I was doing this piece, part of a play called The Great Game Afghanistan. And I was sort of stunned they were doing this series of short plays that went on for 12 hours done over multiple nights about the history of the West and Afghanistan. And I wrote one of the short pieces, which then I expanded into Blood and Gifts, this much bigger full-length play. And I was trying to put my finger on why am I convinced and amazed, why am I amazed this is happening, and why am I convinced this could never happen in New York? Am I just being parochial and snobby? This is my want. But I realized what it was is that the thing that has to be overcome in culture in the States, and paradoxically, the worst offenders in New York. New York is convinced of its specialness to a degree that's based on geography, not personal achievement by and large, is that there's this constant sense of, who are you to tell me anything? I went to college, I know. Which I think is just stupid, and inexplicably, and these are smart, savvy people. So, when you have an audience in New York, it's the hardest thing in the world is to have a play done in New York City as opposed to any other city. Because the audience literally or physically sits like this. What you got? The moment the play starts. And so your job, John Guare wrote this beautiful essay decades ago in the Paris Review where he talked about you had about 15 minutes to get the audience, engaged. I think you get about 7 minutes now. And it's less engaged. And I use this analogy or image when I'm talking to young playwrights at universities. I say, your job is to find a way to get the audience to do that. And you have 7 minutes, or they're not going to cross their arms. And, it's hard. Yeah. It's a great challenge and it's fascinating, but it's really hard because the paradox is that what everybody wants desperately is to uncross their arms. But they're going to make it hard for you. And I sit down and I find myself doing it, going, my God, you're doing the same thing. I don't know what the point of that is, but I find it interesting.
No, I guess one of the questions I've had, you and I have had this discussion for a long time, but I'm fascinated by, this sounds terrible to say, but how little, sort of role artists as intellectuals play in our culture. And
yeah.
I kind of feel like it's almost bigger than that. That is that as you sort of think about this more broadly, my sense, say in France, as you say in the UK, that you would find intellectuals, particularly in the arts, playing a larger role kind of in the civic discussion. And I feel like that is something, that doesn't happen sort of in the US. And it's interesting to me that you seem to be.
Yeah, it ties into this, and I think it's just, it's tradition that people don't, or it's there's a shying away from or an anxiety that you're going to be too big for your britches in a way, I think. But I think also people aren't. It's a funny profession. It's like any profession. There are subcultures within subcultures, and the theater is a strange. We call people who aren't in the theater civilians. The theater is a strange culture, but the divide between, again, being very sweeping, musical theater culture and straight theater culture is vast. But in straight theater culture, the smaller group of those of us who are interested in larger things, we're like desperately clinging to each other when we meet each other, like, oh yeah, you're part of the tribe within the tribe, because, yeah. But I also want to double back, and I'm saying these things. I'm hoping I'm not trying to be pessimistic or sour, because look, I'm doing pretty well. I work at the National Theater and Lincoln Center. I don't have a lot to complain about, but it's just. As someone who also sits outside what I do and is part of a larger culture, as you all are in this room, and the kind of person like you that would come to hear someone in a profession other than your own talk about what they do, everyone in this room is an outlier in American culture by the very fact that you're here. Put that in your pipe and smoke it.
I guess one of the things, just one last thought on this, but it's interesting to me that, and you and I have had this conversation, it seems to me that there was a period where artists played a larger role. Sort of the 50s. There were times when people, there was a common conversation about the latest great book, that literature and art and playwrights would appear on national.
On Dick Cavett.
Yeah. Yes, it's interesting to me just that. I agree with what you're saying, but I do feel like something has changed in the way we view the theater.
Well, some of it is the theater's fault. I do think that theater, for economic reasons and for currying favor with commerce, the theater has become much safer and much smaller and more personable and little. And those plays are, in the short term, always embraced, because that which is comforting is always embraced first. And people make money, and the shows get done a lot. But ultimately, they're not really that interesting, and I think in the long view, what's happened is it's taken the profession out of the conversation. And I think that what's interesting is it's such an extraordinarily powerful tool for conversation and learning on a deep personal level, not as a tautological finger-waving way, but. And then occasionally something, I've had my experience of writing plays about things and the audience response and just getting to come and talk with you tonight is, I constantly like my career as an example that people are actually really interested. When high school kids have come to see my play en masse, it's like a rock star concert. They're so excited and you think, oh yeah, and my plays are difficult. You know what I mean? Because they're all of a sudden being spoken to about, they're like, wow, people would actually talk about this? Grown-ups would talk about this? And so, what's so powerful is, we were talking about this in your class today. I was using this example, and it's a little unfair because it's such an outlier, but the incredible cultural volcano of Hamilton, or other ones in the last 20 years like Angels in America, perhaps foolishly out of my own self-interest, but I believe there's this people want to come together and grapple with these massive things, because why are we coming together in a space if we're not interested in that? And or at least I have to believe that, because that's the kind of work that I'm interested in making, and that both nourishes me and delights me when I go to see it.
So I want to make this my last question, and then I want to sort of open it up for the audience. But one of the things that fascinates me in conversation, so you know this, many in the audience don't, but my father was a Methodist minister, so my experience of church involved a community of people who came together, worship. There's a similarity there to theater. You articulated this afternoon. And I guess what I'd like to just kind of close on, we are an extremely divided country. We are growing more divided kind of with every passing minute. And I don't think of many, and it's interesting that we're all gathered here for a meal together to listen to two people talk about, a shared 20, 30-year friendship. But notwithstanding that event, we don't have a lot of places where we come together as a people and do something communal, experience art together, listen to a sermon, perform a religious ritual. We are increasingly isolated. And I guess I thought I would just close this out with kind of how you see theater evolving in that increasing isolation, that we just don't come together. We are divided. I don't know that we want to come together, but I just find very few instances where we do that anymore. Maybe sporting events would be the one exception, but it seems almost the exception that proves the rule.
Yeah, that's a interesting, complicated question. I think that what I would like is the struggle is always, how do you get, as a theater maker and theater lover, how do you get the profession to be in less of a bubble in the nature of what the stories it's telling and who gets to come see it? And I think two things. I think that in the short term, a negative and then a positive, right? A negative, I think, is as things may fall apart in the next 6 months to a year, I think that the theater may become more vital, certainly in certain pockets, as an actual speaking truth to power. The Soviet theater was unbelievable. And the great irony is that once the fear went away, the theaters weren't full anymore. Yeah. But the theaters were full every night for 70 years, from every walk of life. The more positive is, I think that that can be done, that reaching across the aisles as you use. And I think, as someone who doesn't write musicals yet, you never know, I think I often, I stole a lot from American musicals when I was writing Oslo, which on the surface makes no sense, but there is a joyousness and a elegant simplicity and a deep connection from the intellect to the synapses to the gut that does completely transcend class, politics, gender, everything. And there's something incredibly valuable to be learned from that.
I think we should open it up for questions, but it's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, my man.
If you have a question, please raise your hand and Michael or I will come to you with the microphone.
Hello, Mr. Rogers. I really enjoyed your talk. I would just like to ask you a question about journalism, because that's something I'm really interested in. You mentioned that journalism didn't tell the full story because it didn't have a narrative. It was just hard facts, objective facts. And so it would be harder for the viewer to understand fully what's going on and to grasp how humans worked, I guess. And I thought more that journalism these days do take on a narrative. For example, if you read the newspaper, in New York Times, they'll often have pictures that are a bit graphic and try to tell stories by showing a child's face. You'll also have articles that start off with a quote from a civilian talking about their own lives to kind of open up this subject of how war can affect people. And I feel like newspapers these days do kind of like take on this narrative of trying to show a story, but I don't really have a positive view of it, just because I feel like journalism has its own duties, and when it takes on a storytelling narrative, it can, just because the readers trust newspapers to tell objective truth, when you have that narrative, it's gonna kind of impact what truth really is. And so that's the reason that I didn't have a good view of how newspapers kind of start taking on this narrative. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about that.
Well, I didn't. You raised a couple of very interesting points, but it's not that I don't think that there could. I mean, in some senses, a good journalism, piece of journalism, is got to have a narrative and that you want to follow through. very rare, the good narratives are written in the only article. As a lifelong New York Times reader, most of the time I read the first 2 paragraphs and the second from the bottom, and you don't need to read anything else. But a really good one will take me all the way through, or at least, and it's interesting. You're right about this shift in you are there journalism, especially in the Times, to their great credit, and other major newspapers sort of like, you should see what it's like to be a Syrian child. But I think what I'm going to say is I don't want to in any way poo-poo that, and I want to read that in the paper, but in a way, I think that if you were to read a story or a play or even a film that deals with the narrative of that, I think it's actually far more powerful in terms of actually affecting people's change. I think the extraordinary amount of coverage in the New York Times about Syria and the complete lack of movement by the American people to get our government to change it is a fascinating, both dispiriting and fascinating thing. And I think that every art form, and let's call journalism an art form for this purposes, I think obviously anything can be done with any form, and counterexamples are always there. But we talked about, your class talked about this earlier today, that I think that one of the things as you work as a writer, let's say, in a medium over and over, is you learn that there are certain ways of telling information and stories and trying to get to a deeper truth that work better in different forms. And if you don't embrace that, you are going to be tilling at windmills a little bit.
I was going to just add to this, and something you've said on a number of occasions. There's a craft to storytelling, and often, this is going to sound odd, but the facts get in the way of getting that hook that brings people into a story. And so
So here's, just to use an example, just so I'm clear what I was saying earlier. There's a way of talking about things, events in the world, and good and terrible things in a who, what, when, where, why way that is vitally important and necessary. But there are grand questions and problems and things under the surface that can't really be addressed with that kind of writing. And ultimately, it is the moments in our lives as people when the rug is pulled out from under us and we have to question everything we believed about ourselves, that is where story can save you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I wanted to push back a little bit on one of the claims you made earlier about artists not being so involved in public intellectual discourse and things like that. Over the past couple years, we've seen the emergence of shows like Fresh Off the Boat from Eddie Wong, Donald Glover's Atlanta, shows like Blackish, even things like albums from Kendrick Lamar. Those seem to be cases where artists are really pushing the envelope and trying to drive dialogue around narratives. So I just wanted to ask you, is there something that they're not doing that maybe they could do by borrowing from tips from the theater or something like that? Or is there maybe a reason why you see that kind of narrative maybe isn't succeeding in the way that a theater performance does?
No, I admire all of those examples you just gave, and some of them I avidly love to follow. But most examples you gave were not in the theater. So the funny thing is that of the writing I do, that the pinnacle is the theater for me, and it's the profession that is most ideally suited for ideas because it is language driven, and language expressed through ideas. So it's a little bit of like, seriously, TV is doing a better job than us? Come on, guys. So yeah, but you talk to people I know that are working in film and television and doing stuff that is pushing back or complicated, and it's a hard road for them. Atlanta has critical acclaim, justly so, and is being watched, but you put that up against Game of Thrones and you're talking about off Broadway and Hello Dolly. So it is always a struggle. And it's always, and that's just also the nature of it. One of the things you have to learn, if you're a storyteller that wants to talk about more complicated things, we're living in a moment where to be complicated is a political act, right? To just be complicated is a political act. So yeah, so it's not that they're not doing it, it's just more, the starting point for my comment was the theater specifically.
Hi, thank you for your speech. This is more of a response, I suppose, on a question. I'm Russian and Swiss, and I've been living in the US for a few months. And what's interesting to me is, in terms of journalism, what I find very interesting is that a lot of it relies on facts and truth, but more importantly, in terms of, this is about mostly foreign things, a lot of things are omitted, and not because of a lack of information, because, for instance, in Britain, things are written about that aren't here, but essentially if we're cut out, I feel, to feed a certain simplified narrative about certain issues or certain events, but essentially rely on a certain emotion, so it's like sadness or anger, whatever it is. And what I personally am not very fond of in journalism, although it has its own values, I'm sure, is that it tries to have a lot of time kind of a fiery headline to get clicks, I feel, to earn some profit. And it's as simplified as possible, relatively speaking. And it's generally, what's mentioned is strictly what feeds the narrative that publication represents for whatever purposes. Even the big ones like New York Times, for instance. What I like about art, and that could be in theater, but I'm particularly thinking about film because that's what I'm more knowledgeable about, is that I feel like when you're gonna sit down and watch something or listen to a piece of music, whatever it is, but particularly I think in theater and films, the artist must gain the empathy a lot of the time, most of the time I feel, of the audience in order to present their ideas, no matter what they're like. And the fact is, every single aspect of any culture is seen differently. Even racism takes different forms, which here can be imagined, or money, or what's valuable in life. But once a certain hook of empathy is created, then people are more receptive to ideas. However, I feel like in the US in particular, although it's true in most countries to varying degrees, it's not an absolute issue, people here tend to be less knowledgeable about foreign works, whatever they might be it, again, the media or any kind of art. And I feel like one of the ways to simply be more knowledgeable about the world is to rely on art, not necessarily to be purely factual, but to give you a sort of idea about what people are like in another place, what they're going through, more or less. Yeah, because, I mean, there's this quote which is like, write fiction to tell the truth and nonfiction to lie, something like that, which I quite like to some degree. But yeah, so I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah. There's a lot there. Well, one would take us a little off topic, but just one thing I would push back a little bit is I think that we make the mistake, myself included, when we talk about journalism, we put a unbelievably wide swath of things under it. And there's a vast difference between, just to use more left and center and left, and let's write off Breitbart and Fox News and all that. But there's a profound difference between, say, the HuffPost and the New York Times. I mean, the New York Times is the worst paper in the world except for all the others. You try living in London for a month and reading their newspapers, you're like, wow, the New York Times is good. So there's that, but also, yeah, I mean, there's a wonderful, I don't know if any of you have seen, there's a magnificent Iranian film. The director just made a big political act by not saying he wouldn't come to the Oscars for his new film, Salesman. But he made a film about 4 years ago called A Separation, which is about a family drama set in Tehran. And it's this unbelievable, the empathy, the knowledge and empathy you get for the average Iranian living in the film. The film is just, I'm telling a story about people I know, and this is how I'm telling it, and it's commenting obliquely about Sharia law and other elements, but it's really about a man and a wife and a miscommunication that leads to disastrous consequences for the maid. And what's extraordinary in a way that you couldn't have in journalism is that you're watching day-to-day life in Tehran. And as an American, it's absolutely fascinating. And there's a long scene where they have to go to religious court to argue over whether they can have a divorce. And it's this complicated, sort of banal scene between the judge and the using law and ideas about legality and marriage that are deeply alien to the West, but it's just presented as this is what life's like, and you can take what you want out of it. And is someone who knows a hell of a lot about Iran and its history and the political event going on. I came and like, wow, this is like, I have to reevaluate everything that I was thinking about. or that sense like, oh yeah, it's not just a bunch of facts, it's men and women and children and street corners and video games and just like everywhere else. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I just wanted to know your thoughts on the intersection of theater and journalism. Take, for example, the reaction across the political spectrum to Hamilton, especially that situation with Mike Pence. And I'm particularly interested in thoughts specifically concerning the public perception of the theater and how journalism might affect that.
Are you asking for my take on the Pence and Broglio, or you're asking for my...
No, I just
Roger.
provided that as an example.
Oh, yeah.
Just any thoughts you might have on the intersection of theater and journalism.
Well, beyond what we talked about already, I would say, on in terms of the as opposed to what one can tell and one can tell, but the actual intersection in the public arena of journalism and the theater, there's very little. There's a lot in the UK, for better and for worse, and there's very little here, for better and for worse. I'm good friends with Lawrence Wright, who's someone you guys should have talk if you haven't, who wrote The Looming Tower and Going Clear about Scientology. And he's an amazing journalist for The New Yorker, but he also writes plays and is starting to have quite a bit of success. So we get together whenever we can in New York and talk because he's a journalist who's interested in the theater, and I'm a theater who's interested in journalism, and there's nobody else to talk to. So we get talking about, but yeah, there isn't a lot. They're sort of seen as separate spheres in a way that seems odd to me. And just from a ruthless storytelling, practical standpoint, it seems odd like there's a lot of great stories in the world, and there's not that many ways to tell a story about me and my mom that doesn't get boring after a while. So I think, I'd like to see more plays about and movies that had more intersection.
Hi. So you were talking about how theater could make a bigger political commentary. And journalism specifically is sort of held up as a pillar of government, right? Like
As a what of government?
A pillar of government. Like it's supposed to check
Yeah, the
kind
fourth
of
percent.
our democracy, right?
That one too.
Like the fourth
Yeah.
pillar.
Yeah.
Do you think art and theater in particular has an obligation to respond, has an obligation to make a political commentary? No.
Absolutely not. I like doing that, but I think the moment you say that art has an obligation to X, you're effed. You know what I mean?
Good
I
to
think
know.
that journalism journalism exists to hold truth to power, but art doesn't have to justify its existence. Art is art. And the moment we have to try to justify it, I think we fall into what we talked about earlier today in the class about the mechanisms and weights and measures of value and commerce and it does this on the good scale. No, art doesn't need to justify. It just is. Some of it's great, some of it's terrible, but it just is.
Thank you for your talk. So I wanted to ask, what impact does and to what extent do you insert an autobiographical element in some of the plays, especially in cases in which they don't actually pertain necessarily directly to your own life?
You're saying if I do or how I do?
Both.
I wouldn't tell you how. I would never tell you how. And sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't. And often if I do, I didn't realize I did it till later. I wouldn't tell you how just because that's like getting naked in front of you. I'm not going to do that. Attractive.
I'm not letting you off the hook that easily.
Yeah.
I found that,
I mean,
there's an interesting. No, it's too late. But one of the fascinating things about you write about people who are very different than yourself and have very different sort of life experiences, and you do it very convincingly. And I don't necessarily mean, please, tell us exactly how you make that happen. But
that's different than the revelation of autobiography. It goes back to what I was saying earlier about the actor and the mask. It's liberating, and I'm not alone. This is not an original revelation for me as a writer or a theater maker. To wear a mask, paradoxically, allows you to be more free. Yeah. If I were up here playing a character, doing a scene for you as an actor, and then I did the same thing while wearing what's called a neutral mask, not a mask like a funny face, but like a mask that's of a stylized blank slate, you would be amazed at how all of a sudden I seemed to be 2 feet bigger, and my gestures were more powerful, and my voice was changing. And in some ways, I wouldn't even be aware I was doing it. I was just freed from being myself by having an absence of myself.
Thanks for coming tonight. I started thinking about the different mediums of art, and music and movies and TV shows at this point are really readily accessible on the internet and streamable. You know, it's nice to see a piece of art in person, but you can view most of that online too. Books are very permanent, unless you burn them, I guess. But in contrast, it seems to me the theater is a relatively impermanent form of art, and for the most part, you really have to be there. Do you think that that's to its benefit or to its detriment?
It's to its struggle in the current moment because so much is so clickbaitable. But paradoxically, it's the thing that will make it survive, because he says, both optimistically and I also believe this, that as we go forward culturally, we're going to more and more hunger for the real and the thing that can't be on your Facebook feed. And to use the example of just pointing at a painting, I'd submit to you that for me, again, exceptions always included, that what to me is good visual art is the thing which, no matter how much I liked it on screen, I have to stand in front of it to get its power. And I think that the theater is just a even more concentrated example of that. I mean, you can listen to the Hamilton soundtrack. It's pretty great, but it ain't the same thing.
Hi. So I want to know, okay, so with your storytelling, you are holding a mirror unto life and telling these stories of people that you meet and people that you get to know. But of course, you're allowed to embellish it a little and take it somewhere for entertainment value as well. But I want to know sort of what about your obligation to your interlocutors to do them justice, and
right.
And who checks your lens, and do you check your position?
I kind of devised a rule for this last play that I realized I had consciously, or maybe unconsciously, been doing, but it's just because of the high wire act of it being based on the names of the people. The rule I came up for myself was, the only thing you can't do is to have someone on stage saying the opposite of what the person in real life believes. An extreme flippant example would be a member of the PLO saying how they think it's great that Israel is Israel. I'm just being very broad. So that would be. In terms of other people, I have other people dramaturgically check my work through the crucible of doing rehearsal and probing questions from your director and your first readers you trust, and you watch. Theater is an interesting that unlike other professions, you do all of your learning and you're failing in public in the theater. Oh, that doesn't work. They're bored. So there's a built-in humiliation factor that you have to get used to. But in terms of, I actively would never allow, nobody involved in even people I interviewed at length, I would never show them the document, the play, and say, what do you think? Because I'm not that. Then you're forget it. And so it is an interesting balance, because on one hand you're trying to be both open-hearted and empathetic and respectful. On the other hand, there are the ruthless demands of being an artist. You're like, no, I want to tell it this way because I want to do this. I'm not really interested in what you think. Yeah. And they have every right not to like it, obviously.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have left for questions.
Those
Please
were
join
great.
me
Thank
in
you guys.
thanking
What a lovely
Professor
evening.
Held and
I
JT
really
Rao.
appreciate your comments.